or afternoon, depending on where you are joining from. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the session on humanitarian engagement with religious actors. My name is Katherine Kramer, and it is my pleasure to facilitate this session. So thank you to the organizers for asking me to join. For over 20 years, I have engaged with armed actors to improve the protection of civilians, most prominently in my role with Geneva Call, where I led the organization's work in Asia for 15 years, and in my current role as senior manager for the protection of civilians with Interaction, a Washington-based organization with around 200 humanitarian and development NGOs members, which is a convener, thought leader, and voice for NGOs in, among other things, shaping US policy and practice. I'm very happy to be joined by our panelists today, who will be presenting their work to us. We have Dr. Olivia Wilkinson, who's with the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, and Professor Emma Tomalin from the University of Leeds, and they will be presenting their work entitled Secular Religious Dynamics and Their Effect on Humanitarian Norms Compliance. And we also have Mr. Dominic Earnshaw from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and hopefully we can be joined by his colleague, Mr. Datuan Magon, who's with the Regional Madrasah Graduate Academy in Mindanao, who will be presenting on their work entitled Engaging Ulama in the Promotion of International Humanitarian Law, a case study from Mindanao. I kindly ask that the participants use the question and answer function to share their reactions, comments, and questions. We will have time towards the end of the session to address them. We will give 10 minutes to each of the sections of work, and then we can follow from there. So I would like to first, I believe Emma is with us, so shall we first start with Dr. Olivia Wilkinson and Professor Emma Tomalin? If
yes.
So, I will turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Morning. Hi. Hi, everyone. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Katherine. And the way we're going to break this up for the 10 minutes that we have is I'm going to speak first, and then I'll pass over to Emma to conclude. So thank you very much for inviting us to speak today. We're speaking on our paper titled Secular Religious Dynamics and Their Effects on Humanitarian Norms Compliance. So this paper encourages a nuanced examination of the many powerful forces that take part in the sometimes overwhelmingly negative connotations of religions that we hear amongst many perspectives from humanitarians in the humanitarian sphere. And what we're looking at a little bit more is the less explored idea of secular influence, the interplay of secular religious dynamics, and the intersection of these with other forces of power, such as neo-colonizing control and north-south divides that are often strongly at play in humanitarian encounters. As such, we're arguing that not only are analysis of religious actors important in debates on humanitarian norms compliance, but that secular religious dynamics must also be part of that analysis in order to fully understand the actions and reactions of religious and humanitarian actors alike. So my section is a little bit more on the background, the theoretical side, and then Emma will speak on the case examples. So to further unpack the secular religious dynamics of the humanitarian sphere, we need to examine the aspects of fear and distancing from religions that can occur in the humanitarian subconscious. So firstly, we have this idea that religion is politicized, violent, and extremist, or this stereotype that will always be the case. This is established in the concept described by Beth Shackman Hurd as the two faces of religions in international relations. Religion is separated into a binary of good and bad religion. So bad religion is often associated with actors categorized as extremists in that it seems to be oppressive, non-compliant with human rights, particularly women's rights, and particularly for humanitarians, non-compliant with humanitarian norms. Concepts such as humanitarian space, the tangible and intangible spaces constructed by humanitarians' physical and normative presence asserted by IHL to save lives and alleviate suffering, need to be constructed in part because of the nefarious intent of actors from bad religion. Bad religious actors aim to impinge on humanitarian space to cause harm to humanitarians and those they aim to protect. To maintain humanitarian space, humanitarian principles such as neutrality and impartiality are asserted to demonstrate why humanitarians must not only stay away from bad religious actors, but why humanitarians are justified in a fear of religious actors. And of course, I'm putting this in the kind of extreme terms to make the point about this a stereotype. Second, that bad religion stereotype is challenged when good religious actors arrive on the scene. They are more progressive, at ease with international humanitarian language and norms, and generally compliant with a full range of humanitarian demands, from the norms established by IHL to the norms of other compliance within the international humanitarian system, such as financial reporting or monitoring and evaluation. They're also often so assimilated into this system, in fact, that they are not obviously religious to the uninitiated, or perhaps in name only. This actor-oriented analysis that Emma has pointed out in some of her publications demonstrates how religious actors present themselves in certain ways to the international humanitarian system in order to fit in. And it's for these reasons that other scholars, such as Alistair Ager, have described the system as functionally secular. And this functional secularity manifests in several ways in the norms of the humanitarian system. The principles of neutrality and impartiality are interpreted as barriers to religious engagement. Religions are often mentioned once and once only in humanitarian publications, and that they are listed in the range of identities which should not be used to discriminate on for the provision of assistance, alongside gender, age, ethnicity, politics, other definitions. So the effect of this inclusion in definitions of impartiality, but exclusion of religious analysis in almost all other humanitarian study, policy, practice, leads to, quoting from Alistair Ager again, a curious distortion of the laudable goals of neutrality and impartiality, that local agendas and forms of thinking are displaced to the margins, while Western secular constructions of religion, for example, this good-bad religion divide and stereotypes, enjoy relatively unchallenged power. So there's more to be discussed on that point. It's quite complex, but I will hand over to Emma to go into the examples from South Sudan.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks very much. Can you flip to the next slide? Thank you, thank you. Okay, so in order to illustrate the background that Olivia has just provided, we're going to focus on two recent research projects in South Sudan, both of which examine the roles of faith actors in humanitarianism. So the first example comes from a study completed with Dan Church Aid through interviews with local actors in South Sudan on the implementation of the triple nexus, so the linking between humanitarian development and peace operations. And we found that international humanitarians often looked to local faith actors to address the peace building part of the triple nexus. Thereby they were taking on the role of good religion, while at the same time challenging this very widespread assumption that faith actors are incapable of neutrality and impartiality. And these, of course, are the very qualities that they're actually demonstrating here as they're being sought after as effective peace builders by international humanitarians. And this was also echoed in our second project, where we teamed up with Tear Fund Islamic Relief and Redar in South Sudan to carry out research on a humanitarian project which aimed to facilitate a two-way learning process between international humanitarians and local faith actors. And in this research, we also heard that local actors, including faith actors, were often the only ones able to provide assistance, demonstrating that when humanitarian norms compliance was not happening as necessitated by international human rights law to allow humanitarian access, that the local faith actors' relationship of trust and access meant that they were able to offer humanitarian assistance where others could not. And as an example from an Episcopal diocese in the south of the country demonstrates, and this is what the quotation, one of the quotations on the slide, even though the political situation makes it very difficult for humanitarian agencies to access the area, the bishop, as a neutral person, is able to provide access for field staff to the area. So if there is support to implement projects there, we will at least be able to reach the vulnerable on the ground. So local faith actors are also amongst the broader group of local actors who continue delivering assistance when, again, a lack of humanitarian norms compliance has driven large-scale evacuations of humanitarians, such as the large-scale evacuations that we saw after attacks in Juba, the capital of South Sudan, in July 2016. And we heard in our research, and again, this is the quote on the slide, that there's a need for local faith actors and national NGOs to be involved, because these are the people that are related to the community, people trust them, and also these are the people that can go further than the international NGOs can, because of far distance and because of the security situation. And again, these international NGOs, sometimes when there's a disaster or any instability like a war, always they evacuate, but the national NGOs and the local faith actors, they've always been there, they remain there. Nevertheless, in the humanitarian project that we were studying in this research, it was the local faith actors that proved to be really keen, very keen and engaged to learn about humanitarian norms so they could be better connected to the international humanitarian system. But the international humanitarians, on the other hand, were much harder to convince about the need for them to better understand the work of local faith actors. So just to make a few concluding remarks to pull everything together, we've tried to demonstrate that secular humanitarianism or international humanitarianism has tended to be both reductive and biased in its avoidance of engagement with local faith actors from assumptions that they're incapable of neutrality and impartiality. Our research has given a much more nuanced picture and suggests that there's not only a need to build awareness of humanitarian norms with faith actors, something that we've found, that they're very keen to engage in, but also to work with the secular actors, the international humanitarians, about the perceptions that they hold and that prevent them from engagement with religious actors around humanitarian norms and humanitarian engagement. So it was a very brief introduction to a huge topic, but thank you for listening to us, and we look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia and Emma, for sharing this thoughtful piece on the obstacles the international humanitarian community place on engaging with religious actors. I was particularly moved by the comment on the need for international humanitarian community to acknowledge their biases and contextual ignorance, as well as perhaps even more importantly, that the secular approach to humanitarian work is a power construct. And if localization is to be embraced, that this will need to be addressed. I would now like to hand the floor over to Dominic, and if Datuan has joined us, to him as well to present their work. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katherine. Let me just share my screen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic.
And we can see as well.
You can see the screen, great. Unfortunately, there's a big storm in Mindanao, which has affected Dats's internet. He is trying to join, but we'll see. Hopefully by the end of the presentation, he is able to be here. So first of all, thank you to the organizers of the conference, and very happy to have you as the moderator, Katherine. I'm sure you know a lot about the background of this topic, and actually you were one of the people we would like to interview as the project goes on, because I know you were there with Geneva Paul in the early days. So yeah, so as you can see, the title of the project is rather broad, but for this presentation, we will just consider one aspect of the engagement with ulama in Mindanao, and that is the code of conduct of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF. So what this stage of the research, it's only in the beginning, we do hope to continue. We'll look at the historical factor, examining how and why the MILF decided to introduce the code of conduct, and it's also reflexive based on the experience of Dats and I in working with MILF Islamic scholars to disseminate the code to fighters. The research was based on interviews with Islamic scholars in Mindanao, both those directly affiliated with the MILF and with independent scholars. So as the time is limited and Dats has these internet problems, I will do the presentation, but it was Dats that did most of the legwork, and he's got a much deeper knowledge of the subject than I will ever have. So first of all, a quick background on the conflict in Mindanao. Mindanao is the southernmost major island of the Philippines and has a large Muslim population. The island has seen conflict on and off for centuries, first through resistance of local states to colonial encroachment by the Spanish and later Americans, and then following independence. In the 1960s and 70s, tensions began to grow with the new national government of the Philippines, particularly after imposition of martial law by President Ferdinand Marcos. This led to the formation of organized resistance, initially under the banner of the Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF. And then in 1984, a faction of the MNLF led by Salamat Hashim broke off to found the MILF. The stated reason was that the MNLF leadership was being manipulated away from an Islamic basis, though differences in opinion related to the peace process were clearly also important. And the armed wing of the MILF is the Bangsamoro Islamic Armed Forces, usually known as BF. So from the very beginning of the MILF, ulama have played a key role. I mean, religious scholars are strongly represented throughout the organization. The founder, Salamat Hashim, spent 9 years at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, leaving just before graduating for his doctoral studies. Azhar graduates made up a large part of the first generation of MILF leaders, though among the current generation, anecdotally, it seems that Medina graduates are now predominating, and this has had an impact on the character of the theological guidance provided to the community. Islamic scholars are present in the Central Committee, BF command positions, and the Islamic Call and Guidance Department, which appoints Murshid, basically an Islamic chaplaincy, to all BF units. And just to give a picture of how things look on the ground, I mean, the MILF was never really a small guerrilla organization, it's a mass organization. And since its formation has had a very strong influence in both religious and secular society in central Mindanao. And its bases were like whole communities with schools, courts, prisons, and the MILF ulama were serving both the BF members and the community at large. And the MILF also had a strong influence among ulama in government areas. So the focus of our presentation today is on the code of conduct and rules of engagement of the MILF. From the 1990s, as peace talks progressed, the MILF wanted to have a more formalized working of how the organization would operate. And according to its own accounts, the general staff of the Bangsamoro Islamic Armed Forces began work on a detailed code of conduct in the 90s, but frequent outbreaks of hostilities made progress slow and the attempt lost steam. It was restarted following the death of founder Salamat Hashim in 2003, and work on the code resumed and was completed in 2006. So now, only a couple of months following the initial release of the initial code of conduct, 2 amendments were brought in, which stipulated rules of engagement in Islam and set the minimum age for BF personnel at 18. And today it's the rules of engagement that we are focused on. I hope you can see on the screen. The rules of engagement are very brief, but they contain 8 points covering the main precepts of IHL, troop behavior, distinction, protection of civilians, prisoners, etc. But all of them except one expressed through verses of the Quran or through hadith. Having worked, Dats and I both worked extensively with these rules of engagement while with the ICRC in Cotabato, and were interested to record the history of how and why they came about, particularly as a number of the key people involved have already passed away. So what we found was, humanitarian organizations, ICRC, Geneva Call, UNICEF have been working with the MILF for a number of years through the 1990s on incorporating humanitarian norms and IHL into its doctrine. An early statement from the MILF was the 2002 signing of a deed of commitment with Geneva Call on a total ban on anti-personnel mines. However, when it came to IHL more generally, before it could incorporate it into its formal doctrines, the MILF had to grapple with how this would impact its self-image as an Islamic revolutionary organization, whose main aim, according to the founding statement of Salamat Hashim, was to make supreme the word of Allah and establish Islam in the Bangsamoro homeland. So therefore, rather than just taking IHL and straight away incorporating it into its doctrine, the MILF set up a committee of scholars supported by its legal department to review IHL and decide whether or not it was compatible with Islamic law. According to the interviews we conducted, the scholars found that it was not, in most cases, was not complicated to support most of the core precepts of IHL from an Islamic perspective. However, there was some debate on 2 points. The first was on treatment of prisoners of war, where the Quran leaves open the possibility of ransoming prisoners, as well as treating them graciously. However, a consensus was reached that IHL provisions on prisoners of war were not contrary to Islamic law, so could be adopted. There was a similar discussion around the minimum age of 18, which was being pushed by UNICEF for recruitment to the BF. However, in the end, there was a consensus that this was it was not against Islam, that there had been changes in society since the time of the Sahaba, and therefore it could be incorporated. The scholars also decided to keep the references, the Islamic references, very simple, basing only on the surah of the verses of the Quran and the Hadith, rather than other sources of Islamic jurisprudence. So to understand why the MILF decided to produce these IHL compliant rules of engagement, I think it's more interesting to look at quotes from some of the people involved. So what came out from, these are just 2 of the interviews we did, but what came out from all the interviews was how focused the MILF was on international legitimacy at this time in the first few years of the 21st century. This reflects both at this time the MILF was already looking at peace agreements and transitioning to governance, so needed that legitimacy, and also all this work on incorporating IHL came in the peak years of the global war on terror. So while the MILF was doing this, US troops were in other parts, were in Sulu in the southern Philippines, working on anti-terror operations against Abu Sayyaf, another Moro group to emerge from the MNLF. And the MILF was very, very focused on not being linked to terrorism or seen as an enemy in the war on terror. So here we have a couple more quotes from interviewees, just to get an impression of how MILF scholars thought about IHL in relation to their overall worldview. I mean, we can see if we look at the quote from Ustaz Abdullah, who is a scholar commander, a major leader of the BF's 109th Base Command, that he saw IHL as a useful tool in creating discipline among his fighters, but was always in a clear subordinate position to religious teachings. So now, looking at how, following the introduction of the Code of Conduct, the MILF worked to transmit this to the troops. Another major advantage of the Islamic framing of the rules of engagement was that it meant that could be easily incorporated into the general religious guidance provided by the Islamic chaplaincy or the murshid. All the interviewees we spoke to said that the murshid in each BF unit had been instructed to incorporate the rules of engagement into their religious guidance and their sermons. And here is also where the ICRC became involved in a number of ways, working together with the MILF on promoting the code, from simple things such as funding the translation and printing of pocket cards of the rule of engagement for troops. The ICRC also supported MILF scholars with IHL training and encouraged scholars from the MILF to take part in international workshops in Islam and IHL, to allow them to have a more detailed ability to interpret IHL from an Islamic perspective in their guidance for the BF Murshid. The ICRC also worked alongside MILF ulama directly in going into BF camps, speaking to the troops, with the IHL with the ICRC speaking from a pure IHL perspective, whereas the MILF scholars would talk about the law of armed conflict in Islam. Here we have a few more quotes before we come to the conclusion, showing about how the MILF scholars viewed the effectiveness of presenting IHL precepts through an Islamic law framing. All of them said they believed this was likely to be more resonant with BF troops than a pure IHL approach. So coming on now to our conclusion. I mean, it's clear from our findings that finding support for Islamic teachings for the precepts of IHL both made it much easier for the MILF to incorporate it into BF doctrine while maintaining its self-image as an Islamic revolutionary organization, and also allowed better dissemination of the rules of engagement by including it into the regular sermons and guidance provided by the murshid, by the chaplaincy. However, it was also very clear from the research that the primary motivation of the MILF was doing this was international legitimacy rather than the result of respect for humanitarian norms and their own terms. In terms of impact on change of behavior on the ground, we haven't, I mean, the ustads we spoke to believed that it was effective, but if, as we continue this study, we would like to interview more regular BF troops to see how they perceived these rules, whether they were part in disseminations, and also a more detailed study of outbreaks of conflict since the code of conduct was introduced. In 2009, just 3 years later, there was a major outbreak of hostilities in Mindanao. So this is also an area we would like to study. And looking more broadly at engagement with ulama in Mindanao, obviously since the peace process, there are still a number of non-state armed groups in Mindanao that have not joined the peace process and have not expressed any interest in legitimacy on the international stage. And we would like to study further how effective outreach to ulama has been with these kind of groups that have not had the same motivations as the MILF in terms of legitimacy. So this is how we see the study continuing in the future. Thank you very much. And I'm not sure if Dats has joined yet or not, but I will follow up with him. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for sharing this work. I mean, obviously, it's something very close to my heart, having worked with the MILF. And what I found quite interesting on that piece is just when you said that, you know, one, the role Islam plays within the organization, and secondly, that they looked at it from the aspect of, does IHL comply with Islam rather than does Islam comply with IHL? So that's one thing I took away from it. Now, I've been asked to share some of my own observations, and also I have lots of questions because both presentations just furthered my thought on what this could say. And remember, I'm from a practitioner, so I take it from a practitioner's point of view. So, you know, at first, it may not seem that the presentations are similar, but that is only at first glance. And once you start thinking about it a bit more, you see some of the similarities. And I'm going to kind of probably flesh those out a bit more in hopes that our discussion can delve into those a bit. So first, they suggest that in different ways, and depending on the context, religious actors might be able to play an important role in securing humanitarian access and adherence to humanitarian principles if humanitarian actors are willing to engage. First, they suggest that an assessment needs to be undertaken to understand the role that religion and religious actors have in the specific context. What level of importance, acceptance, trust, and influence do the different religions and religious leaders have within communities, and more importantly, with and within armed actors? Why might religious actors have more influence on some armed actors than others in the same context? Here, digging deeper into the Philippines context might be interesting. What is the difference between the MILF and the other non-state armed groups that profess to follow Islam? Is it because the MILF religious adherence is given such weight in all aspects of the organization and its membership, and that ulama are part of the leadership structure? Does Islam hold the same importance with other non-state armed groups? And what about the case of South Sudan? The presentation didn't go into as much detail about the different actors that the religious communities were engaging with in order to get humanitarian access. There is also an element of understanding whether influential religious actors are from within the community or external. In some cases, or some contexts, coming from and representing the local community gives added weight, as in the case of South Sudan, but perhaps this is not fully the case in the Philippines. Secondly, it is important to consider the role of terminology. What level of importance, acceptance, and influence can IHL have in the specific context and with armed actors? Would it be more useful to disassociate the norms from the term? In some cases, it might be better not to reference IHL and rather repackage the norms and principles into the local culture and religion. For different reasons, in the US, Interaction has found it better not to mention IHL except in passing, focusing more on practical measures that the Department of Defense can take in avoiding, minimizing, and responding to civilian harm. Otherwise, one can get into endless discussions with the Office of General Counsel lawyers that get nowhere. Finally, both papers suggest that strengthening humanitarian engagement with religious actors can aid in achieving protection outcomes. Whether this is to change armed actors' policies and practices to be more protective of civilians and thus prevent civilian harm, or to increase civilian populations' access to services they need to survive. The question then comes back to what is the international humanitarian community willing to do to address their own biases and approach to be more conducive to working alongside religious actors. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a practitioner at heart, and so while there is still a lot we can unpack from these two presentations, I would like to hear from our panelists as to where we can go from here to improve interaction between humanitarians and religious leaders in order to achieve protection outcomes. I would then like to revert to what participants have raised in the Q&A function. So I'm not sure who would like to go first. Perhaps we start with Olivia and Emma.
Sure. Yes, I mean, we are speaking to kind of quite a different situation in that we were not, in the way that Dominic was, we were not particularly engaging with religious actors to train them specifically on IHL, or to have this discussion and dialogue about IHL for the purposes of because they were potential participants to the conflict. But we were engaging them as actors who were learning about the humanitarian system and humanitarian norms overall, and therefore learning about IHL as part of that. So we did find that, yes, there was going to be this kind of disconnect between, as Emma presented at the end, how eager what we were terming local faith actors for the purposes of this research were to learn about principles and norms such as IHL, versus how much the humanitarian system were willing to engage with those local faith actors. And so we did find that our challenge was not so much to convince the local faith actors about the importance of the principles, for example, but to work with some of the humanitarian actors to say, well, there are useful local faith actors doing this work. But the other aspect to it was that we did just notice perhaps this element of what we might call some instrumentalization, in that humanitarian actors, international humanitarian actors, were interested in the local faith actors if they saw a role for them as peace builders, negotiators, playing a role in the conflict. And that's when all of a sudden international humanitarians were very interested in the local faith actors, rather than engaging in a bigger picture way about all the work that they were doing. So we have to be careful to notice the moments of instrumentalization that local faith actors experience when they are perhaps used to negotiate humanitarian access when international humanitarians cannot. That didn't answer all your questions, Katherine, but just what immediately came to mind. Emma, anything to add?
No, not particularly. I mean, just to say that we're still sort of very much, what we did was more of a pilot project, and we're still very much in the middle of sort of rethinking how we would do this again differently in the future, to perhaps find ways of better engaging the international humanitarians in working on this two-way model, bearing in mind that their level of enthusiasm, perhaps their ability within their existing workloads and work processes, makes it perhaps more difficult for them. They don't have the flexibility that many of the local faith actors have, just to turn up to meetings and to participate in trainings and so on. So this is a work in progress.
Thank you. And perhaps we can now hear from Dominic, and we just saw that Datuan has managed to join us. So welcome, Datuan.
Okay, thank you, Katherine. I will start, because I think Datuan missed the questions, missed your part. So yeah, I think you made some very interesting points. The repackaging of IHL, whether to even reference IHL, I think is an interesting one. You'll have seen on the rules of engagement that the MILF did. They chose not to mention IHL at all. As far as I remember, there's no mention to IHL. It mentions, protection of civilians, but at no point does it reference IHL. It then goes straight to the Hadith or the Surah or the relevant verse from the Quran. So also I saw a question pop up from Chris about the ICRC's dissemination with the MILF, which I guess this is an interesting point. Would it be more effective for the ICRC to work purely with the scholars, to give them, support them with the IHL training, then let them go off and deliver their dissemination sessions to the troops purely from an Islamic perspective, without ICRC there, and without mentioning IHL, just mentioning these rules of engagement in Islam that they found? Or does it also add something to have the ICRC there and discussing IHL at the same time alongside the scholars talking about the Islamic law of war, which is how we've worked in both ways. I mean, we've both worked with the scholars and let them go off, and we've worked alongside in front of the troops together. So as Dats and I joined this project quite late, so we only really started researching in October. We'd like to go a lot more broader with the research, but this is the kind of questions we'd like to look at: which methodology was more effective, what the troops felt to have having us turning up in their camps and the like. And then also in terms of other non-state armed groups in Mindanao, in the Philippines. I mean, they're all, thinking of the Moro groups, I mean, they're all very Islamically set up. I mean, the main ones, the IFF, actually broke away from MILF in 2010, following a major outbreak of hostilities, when I think there was some disagreements about this kind of thing about IHL applying, and some of the more hardline units broke off and set up their own organization, again, led by scholars. Off the top of my head, the leader of the BIFF was also a Medina graduate who's now passed away. That would be able to say more. And this, again, is a way where we want to take the study. As you mentioned, I mean, for the MILF, the impression we got from the scholars, they weren't really looking at, when they made this rules of engagement, what does Islam say about rules of engagement? They were doing it the other way around. They were saying, here is IHL, we want to follow IHL, but because we're an Islamic group, we can only follow it if it's in line with Islam, if it doesn't contradict Islam. So then they went through all of the main precepts of IHL saying, does this contradict? And that's how they came up with this rules of engagement. Obviously, if you have a group that's not interested in international legitimacy, not interested in international engagement, this would be a very different process. You'd have to actually engage the scholars for them, you know, to come out with something that respects humanitarian norms without having it necessarily framed in IHL, because they have no interest. Certainly some of the groups, you know, if you talk about Islamic State in Mindanao, Abu Sayyaf group have zero interest in IHL. I mean, we've tried for them, this is a secular man-made product and there's no interest. With the IFF, you know, it's a breakaway from the MILF, so maybe we have engaged ulama. They're certainly all over Mindanao, not just MILF ones. So as we come later in the study, we want to look at how this works, coming from the kind of pure Islamic law of armed conflict in Islam angle, without the groups that are necessarily aiming for IHL compliance. So this is really where we'd like to take the study if we continue it. So thank you.
Great, thanks. And I know Datuan missed most of the conversation's questions so far, but is there anything you want to add?
Might not be able to hear, the internet's been going really, here we go.
No, okay. My understanding is we might be at time, but is there a last question from participants? I only saw one. No?
I would have a question if you'd allow me to abuse my organizer.
Go for it, Joanna.
Role. Thank you very much. First, please allow me to thank you. This has been one of the richest panels and one of the most critical one, but I think we learn from critique. Where do you see your research, both projects, where do you see it contributing to practice most?
I can go first. So the research that we were doing both had kind of was very practical in its immediate application. In fact, one of the projects was we were basically researchers embedded in an otherwise humanitarian response project. So it wasn't the effects were meant to be kind of almost immediate as we were feeding back the research results to the project overall. But I think the bigger picture is that we are trying to encourage this idea of not just analysis of religious actors as a discrete topic where you just look at the religious elements, but this idea of examining the secular religious dynamics and how power and control between international and local actors are also reflected in some of those secular religious dynamics as well. So that's where we are in a lot of our other work that we're doing, thinking about other ways to do, what might be called strategic religious engagement. And that includes working with the secular actors to uncover a little bit more about maybe some of the barriers that are stopping their further engagement with religious actors. And that is kind of a whole other piece of work that we work on as well separately.
Is there any final comments that the panelists want to make before we close?
I would answer the question from Joanna, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, just to say, so for our research, I mean, how we see it being useful, I say there's two main points. First of all, based on the kind of narrow focus, because of the time pressures we've had so far on the MILF Code of Conduct, I think it's useful because for me, it's a very interesting example for any Islamically based armed group that is interested in incorporating IHL, that has concerns owing to it, its internal self-image as being based on Islamic theology. I know this has been kind of replicated. I think Katherine was involved by the Patani United Liberation Organization, who also made a code of conduct based on Islam. And I think understanding how this worked with the MILF, because it's been a very, very, it's been a great engagement with the MILF, basically. Understanding how this worked, having a clear history of, what encouraged them to do it, what was their motivations, how they went about it, how the scholars worked with IHL, how we supported the scholars, then hopefully it can be replicated with similar groups in other parts of the world that want to engage. And then the second part of the study, which we've not done yet, about the other Islamic groups in Mindanao that don't have this desire for IHL at the minute, is to look at, we've also worked with ulama in Mindanao beyond the MILF for 10 years now, with the Mufti, with scholars all through the Sulu Archipelago, is to examine, what the impact of this work has been so far, how we can improve it, and then feed back into our work by the ICRC and other actors who are engaging with religious actors on humanitarian norms. So that's how I see the study, the use of it. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And as we wrap up here, it would be nice to hear if any of our panelists have any final words. Perhaps, again, I'll just go to my right, which would actually be to Dominic again. I don't know if you have any final words you want to leave us with.
Honestly, I just thank you to everyone for organising it, and my other presenters. I mean, it's we obviously we're coming from a very practical side. That's and I, we're both practitioners, so it's also great to hear the more scholarly, theoretical, and I'm sure there's a lot we can learn from each other, the practitioners and the academic side, in terms of improving and enriching the work. So thank you all.
Thank you, Olivia.
Yes, ditto. It was really interesting to hear about your project, Dominic. So thank you so much. I think that Katherine as well, thanks for bringing everything together when we're, talking in potentially quite different ways. But as you say, there are these overlaps and parallels. So that was great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Olivia. And Emma.
No, I don't really have anything to add, but thank you. And as we've said, Dominic, it was lovely hearing your paper and great hearing your perspective from a practitioner's point of view as well, Katherine, on our work. So thank you very much.
Great. And Datuan, if you have anything you want to say, or you can add it in the chat if you have connection problems.
Thank you for this opportunity. My apology, my signal, we have bad weather here in Southern Philippines. Good evening.
Well, we are in any case very glad to have heard about your work. Dominic gave a great presentation of it. I'm sure he'll fill you in on the details and the discussion. And for all the speakers, we look forward to hearing how your work evolves. I'm sure it will be very useful to us in the field as we try to enhance the protection of civilians on the ground and achieve our protection outcomes.